We're campaigning for a 10% cut in military spending globally, with the intention of that money both demilitarizing and moving towards more peaceful ways of thinking, as well as that money serving for other actual security needs that have to do with social needs, climate, and other forms of what we see as human security, as what really makes us safe. That's the very general idea of the campaign. We'll put a link later on to whoever wants to join and read more about it. But today we are focusing on aspects to do with climate and militarism. We are just a few days after the Global Week of Action for Peace and Social Justice, which is a week of action organized by activists around the world looking at the connection between militarism and the climate disaster, but also, and this is what we're trying to do here, looking at the connection of how more peaceful solutions and more peaceful prospects for the world can also help with the climate disaster and create climate justice. And so what we are hoping to do today is, while we will talk a lot also about the issues and problems with both lack of climate justice and militarism, but hopefully also talking a bit about solutions, what could happen, what could look differently, and specifically how the cost opportunity of cutting military spending could be used for promoting climate justice. And we'll talk a bit about what climate justice means in that context as well. We will have three amazing speakers. We will first have Gaya, who is a climate justice expert, active with a global campaign to demand climate justice, and specifically working in the finance working group that will be speaking to us about where is climate financing at the moment, what are some of the lacking aspects of this, and how we can look at it from a justice perspective. Then we will hear from Raouf and Mohamed, who is active with Debt for Climate, and will speak to us also about the role of debt within creating climate justice or debt cancellation, and how this all connects in that framework of financing. And lastly, Katrin Geyer is the environmental advisor of WILPF International, and will speak to us about also the campaign that WILPF is currently running around moving the money from militarism to other issues, and specifically as we are talking now about the environment. So I don't want to take any more time. So I'm going to just hand it over straight to Gaya.
Thank you so much, Sahar. And it's really great to be here and making these really important links between our various campaigns. Now, climate finance is a very technical area. So what I've tried to do is really give a kind of bird's eye view of the major issues so that we can really situate where military funding sits within that. So I'm going to give you like a whistle stop tour of the major issues around climate finance, some of the debates going on, and some of the opportunities. So yeah, so what I'm going to cover today very quickly is looking at the why, sort of like, what are we talking about with climate finance? What are we trying to finance? What is the rationale behind it? Talk about the what, which is how much is it that we're talking about, and then also the how. Like, where are the sources supposed to come from? What are the funding modalities, and like what's the bigger context in which that these questions sit in the financial system? So in terms of the why, what are we talking about with climate finance? What we're really trying to do is to fund the immense cost of moving our economy away from a carbon intensive economy so that we can mitigate the impacts of climate change, slow it down. Additionally, there is the need to pay for adaptation, for adapting to the impacts of climate change. And more recently, there have been quite intense debates on a new area that requires financing, which is loss and damage, for the loss and damage suffered by communities that cannot be adapted to, and cannot be mitigated. What do we do? How do we compensate people for livelihoods, for entire sort of countries and cultures that might be destroyed as a result of climate change? What is the cost of that? So these are the different buckets of climate action and areas that require financing. And in terms of the framework under which we discuss these needs is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and we have annual climate talks to drill down on these issues, to come up with decisions. And there's a lot of tension within those talks. There is within there are two major camps that we can speak of, which are the developed early industrialized countries, which have caused the majority of emissions, and who should be on the hook to pay for the damage that they have historically caused. And this is actually enshrined within the climate convention under a principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So what this technical term means is that we all have, common responsibilities to act towards climate change, but they're differentiated. They're differentiated by the history of the countries that are coming to the table now to negotiate, and they're also differentiated by the respective capabilities of countries. And in that sense, there is a great emphasis on the fact that developed countries owe developing countries, and developing countries are really the focus of when we're talking about climate finance. We're talking about supporting developing countries who do not have the finance to be able to mitigate, adapt, and to be compensated for the impacts of climate change. And so within the convention, we have this principle, and there are also provisions saying that developed states are obliged to provide financial resources specifically for mitigation and adaptation. And in the last few years, there's been a broadening of the debate around loss and damage, which, we, in the last 2 years, we won a fund for loss and damage. So it is now on the table. The question now is how to force countries to put into it and where the money's going to come from. But this is sort of like just to give you a sense of what we're talking about in terms of the broader impetus for climate finance. So just to give you a topical news item, so just in a couple of months ago, the International Court of Justice ruled that countries are legally obliged to prevent climate change and to prevent the harm caused by it, and that there would be consequences if they fail to do so. And this includes the idea of reparations, which connects to what is being discussed under the Climate Convention. So this is just to give you a sense of the fact that this is a very lively debate that is going on in different legal and multilateral fora, and the ICJ ruling really backs up this idea that there is an obligation to act and that there might be consequences, including financial consequences, if you do not. So let's talk now about the what. So what are we talking about in terms of amounts? Now, climate, the over the last couple of years, there have been a lot of discussions towards quantifying how much climate finance is needed. And as you can imagine, if we're talking about a global level financing for a variety of mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage needs, it's a lot of money, and there are many different analyses looking at how much we need, everything from sort of in the 300 billion range to up to 5 trillion annually. Some of the analyses look at periods of time over 5 to 10 years. Some look at annual amounts. So that there is actually a plethora of numbers out there in terms of how much is required. However, I think most people who are, in the justice field, recognize that it's up in the sort of 5 trillion annual level, and that is in fact the number that civil society groups have been calling for. Now, what has been promised to date? So the kind of reaction of developed countries has been very anemic to the demands for climate finance. Up until 2024, there was $100 billion a year target, which I think almost everybody agreed was a pitiful amount that didn't really reach what was needed. And however, even this amount was never fulfilled. There, I think the OECD did some number crunching in 2023 and said, look, we've almost filled our 100 billion. We're up to about 800, up to about 80% of it. And groups like Oxfam and other groups have drilled into some of the numbers, and what we're seeing is that this climate finance isn't actually being reached in the way that it was promised. There's a lot of creative accounting and double counting of aid as climate finance, which is something that developing countries and civil society have been warning against. What we're also seeing is that a lot of this money is coming as loans, which then add extra burdens to countries. And one of the other problems is that a lot of this money has been mitigation focused. And this is another major debate within the climate finance arena. It's much easier to finance mitigation or activities to slow climate change, for example, renewable energy or other investments that have a return on investment. However, there's a lot less funding for adaptation, which doesn't have as much of a profit motive. And so we've had this $100 billion goal for a number of years. And last year, countries came together to discuss a new goal, a new collective quantified goal on climate finance. And what they came up with was a disappointing 300 billion per year that would be provided. And this is only focusing on mitigation and adaptation. And there is broad recognition this isn't really enough. And this year in Brazil, in the climate talks in November, they will be discussing how to have a pathway to ramp this up to at least 1.3 trillion a year from 2035 onwards. And there's also a big question about how loss and damage financing will be included within that. So hopefully, I know there's a lot of technicalities and acronyms associated with this, but this will give you a sort of a sense of how inadequate the current financing goals are under the climate convention, and how there are big fights to keep ramping this up and big fights to keep expanding where this money can go to. So we've talked about the financing, we've talked about how much. So the other big question is, how is this financing delivered, and how what are the vehicles? So another major area of contention is the type of financing. What we're seeing is a neoliberal vision of how financing should be delivered versus a justice vision. And the tension continues to be that developed countries do not want to open up their public purses to put into climate finance. There is a rerouting of the discussion into private sector, quote unquote, solutions. So like over the last 10 years, those of you who have been involved in development might have been hearing these conversations as well about how we can transform billions into trillions just by pumping it through the private sector and leveraging private finance. There's quite a lot of research out there showing that this is unproven, that the returns on each dollar of public spending is not giving the returns promised in terms of leveraging more private spending. There's also a concern that a lot of precious public money that is coming from taxpayers is going to de-risk private investments and help private actors make profits through using public financing as a backstop. Another major issue, which I'm sure Raouf will talk about, is the fact that a lot of climate finance currently is in the form of loans and adding to the debt burden of countries that are already burdened. And so what the call is for more public finance, and for rich countries to fulfill their responsibilities and to look for sources of finance to put into climate action. Another major area in the how is, what vehicles are we going to use for this financing? So there is definitely, within civil society in developing countries, there is a preference for accountable multilateral funds. There are some buckets under the current climate convention that are supposed to deliver this finance. Well, they're not receiving the amount of funds that one would hope from donors. And secondly, some of these funds are quite bureaucratic and slow. So there's a question mark over how we can improve delivery through these funds. Meanwhile, sort of shades of the first aspect that I brought up about this like neoliberal route, there is a push from the big global North donors to go for bilateral solutions involving private sector and leaning more on multilateral development banks, which historically have delivered finance more through loans. Another key issue, especially in the last few years, that has been coming up in around climate finance is the problem of the broader financial system. So developing countries and civil society have rightly pointed out that even if we fill the bucket with climate finance, there are 100 holes in the bucket where the money is coming out, whether it be through unfair debt payments, whether it be through a flawed global tax system, a trade system that is stacked against developing countries. So there is also a need to link our conversations in climate finance to broader reforms of the financial system. Okay, so now that you've got a sense of the major conversations and debates going on, what are we agitating for? What is the climate justice movement asking for now? The call still remains for the appropriate quantity, but also quality of finance. What we need is non-debt creating finance that is additional to aid finance, not double counted. We need far more public climate finance that is grant-based and for it to be given across the different areas of climate spending that developing countries desperately need, including adaptation and loss and damage. Additionally, these multilateral funding tools that we already have to be strengthened and fully funded. That continues to be a sore point for developing countries and civil society. A major part of the struggle is for the global north to be held accountable, for them to fulfill their obligations as early industrializers who have benefited from the carbon budget that they have overused, and to contribute their fair share to climate finance, as well as their fair share to action. And so what we're calling for is for a range of creative options to look at where this financing, this more public financing can be gathered from, using a polluter pays principle, taxing dirty industries, using mechanisms like windfall and wealth taxes and solidarity levies, and redirecting subsidies, considerable subsidies that are going to dirty energy sources and fossil fuels. And in this area, there is a distinction between the need to support developing countries to meet their development and poverty reduction goals. So there's a focus on global north, addressing global north subsidies as a priority. Additionally, as I mentioned, we need to reform the financial system to address both an unfair debt system and tax system. And we are seeing movements towards that through the UN Tax Convention, call for a UN debt workout mechanism and reform in the debt sector. We need to redirect public resources towards these energy systems and just transition programs. And additionally, we need to really rethink the role of multilateral development banks and the judicious use of loans. And additionally, the private sector. Yes, there is a role for the private sector, but we need to think about where our precious public money is going. Is it going to go to de-risk private investors' investment, or is it going to go to back into the public good to support a transition that benefits everybody?
Thank you very much for that. And I'm sure we will be getting questions. I already have a few, but we'll do that later on. Yeah, I think that this just flows really, really well into Raouf's presentation. So without further ado, Raouf, I'll just give you the stage.
Yeah, I will start from the amazing intervention of Gaya, and yeah, to talk about the opportunity on climate justice if we cancel the debt. So I will try to show some, or to talk about some numbers first to understand the situation. So the developing country, they're facing up to $580 billion in climate-related cost annually. So our countries, the global south country, we have to pay 580 billion every year in climate-related costs. And this included adaptation, loss and damage, disasters, recovery, and all. And the climate finance from the rich country is so far below. I mean, this year, I think, or at least the last number of 2021, it was $89 billion. But the problem that we have here, that this money is not a grant. So the global north are not really paying for climate finance, but they are given loans with benefits. So now climate change become like, let's imagine you're staying in your home and someone rich was passing and he took a stone and threw it on your car and break the glasses. And when you go out and ask him to fix your car, he say, okay, do you know what? I will give you a loan. You fix your car, give me back the money with benefits. And then you question yourself, like, is this logic or is this just thing to do? And this doesn't stop here. Now we have the African country now, we're losing up to 15% of our GDP. And every year we're using all this money. It's due to climate impact. And we have to pay. For countries like Kenya, paying 70% of its revenue to debt. And then you start talking about what's climate justice, what just transition, how can you fix all these problems? And you find yourself having to keep paying money and you're not even able to pay for the social fields. So now with all the debt that we have, that are illegal debt, that are illegitimate debt, but not only that, with this debt that you have to pay, you have no more money, and now you have problem in your countries, and you have to ask for more and more and more and more loans, and you enter on this cycle. And lately, the Senegalese government, they were talking and they find out $11 billion hidden debt, the responsibility of the old regime and of the IMF. And what make the debt illegitimate in the international law? If the debt is given under colonization or it was given to a dictator system with a lack of transparency and. And now the Senegalese government refused to pay. The IMF and World Bank start an investigation trying to see this transparency problems and all. I mean, the project was like for 5 years working, but still now they start talking about transparency. So for example, country like Pakistan in 2022 floods, the damage estimated at $40 billion. The country took new loan from the IMF and the World Bank and other banks to rebuild and to fix the problems and all. And by 2023, over 47% of federal revenue was going to debt repayment. So here talking about the debt cancellation, it's not just a demand. Now it become a right. So asking for the debt cancellation and refusing to pay, it is no more something, I would say not logic but it become like a right because now we're having a legitimate debt. We're having this system using the debt to control country as a colonial or colonial tools. Because when you look before, country, they use war. They take their military, they go to your country to invade them, and they lose a lot of people, they lose a lot of money and all. But now there is a new technique. I will just give you money. I will ask you how you gave back the money. I will tell you how to give back the money, and I will tell you where to put the money and how to invest them and everything. And then you will find yourself colonized by this country. So this is when we start talking about imperialism, about the indirect colonization. And this is what makes the debt illegal and illegitimate. So now, by talking about debt cancellation, that means we're talking about decolonization. And we see how the system works, like it's only about benefits, how it's only about making money. If we see an example from Tunisia with the just transition or with the energetic transition, now we're starting working on the green hydrogen with Germany, and we have no technology, we have no money to start this seawater desalinization, for example, to make the green hydrogen. So what Germany did, they gave us loan to start this project of seawater desalinization. And now we have to do all this project, to use our sun, to take the land from the farmer. And then we gave the hydrogen to Germany, which they have the technology to make the energy. And now we have to buy this energy from Germany. So it is the same technique with the fossil fuel, with the same company, with the same countries. And if we had the opportunity to cancel the debt, we will have more money. If we saw how much we're paying for our debt, in some countries, we're paying up to 50%, 70%. They are illegal debt, they are illegitimate debt. So by canceling this debt, by refusing paying this illegitimate debt, and to invest them and to have the money, we will find the opportunity to fix many other problems. So the question here is the question of sovereignty, is the question of decolonization. If we want to climate justice, we need to be sovereign. We need to decide how we want to use the money, how we want to invest, how we want to do energetic transition, where we want to put the money to pay for adaptation, to pay for loss and damage, and for all the problems. And today, we start seeing some countries talking about debt swap as a solution. And this is, this is very dangerous now. We're talking about giving legitimacy to an illegitimate debt. So by doing this, we will find ourselves not able to catch where the money is coming from, and countries start buying some other debts. And yeah, so the question is, or the demand are to cancel the debt, and by canceling the debt, it's not just, it's not just we're demanding, but it become a right. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers for hosting this webinar. I think it is such a crucial time to be having these discussions in these times of hyper militarization, really. So WILPF, my organization, is the oldest feminist peace organization in the world, and we have been calling for the reallocation of military spending basically since our founding over 100 years ago. But yeah, I think really now more than ever, there is such a huge need for centering this discussion, these discussions that we're having today. So yeah, I'm really grateful for the hosts and also for the 10% campaign. And in that context, I also want to share that WILPF has also recently launched a very similar campaign to the 10% campaign, which is called Move the Money, Stop Funding War, Start Building Peace. And we're really grateful for the mutual support of both of these campaigns. But yeah, just to reiterate that at WILPF, we are in full support of the 10% campaign and really any and all demands that call for a reduction in military spending, demilitarization, enforcements of arms embargoes, and really any collective organizing in support of these demands. So I wanted to take my time today to speak a little bit about WILPF's work on amplifying the issue of military spending versus climate finance in the COP space, so the UN climate talks. But before this, I just wanted to remind ourselves very briefly that military spending isn't only taking away resources from climate finance, mitigation, adaptation, all of the areas that we've heard the previous speakers talk about, but militarism also profoundly exacerbates the climate crisis and has a huge detrimental impact on the environment in general. So I just want to briefly mention here a few key points. So firstly, there is a conservative estimate that suggests that military activity contributes 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And just to put that into perspective, we know that the civil aviation industry emits around 2.5%, so half of that. So it's a huge chunk of the global emissions. And what's really important here to note as well is that there's a positive correlation between military emissions and military spending. So the higher the military spending, the higher the military emissions will be. And beyond the 5.5% number from military activity, there's additional destruction and emissions happening during active conflict. And there's been really stark estimates coming out of the Russia's invasion of Ukraine and also Israel's ongoing genocide in Gaza. But it really also goes beyond emissions. So military activity during so-called peace times, as well as armed conflict, really exacerbates environmental destruction. It pollutes water, air, and soil. Military activity in conflict exacerbates deforestation, decimates biodiversity. So it's a really an essential piece to look at when we're looking at root causes of the climate crisis. So now I want to speak a little bit about our work on raising awareness of these intersections at the COP. So when WILPF started to systematically engage with the COP a few years ago, we realized that there was a general lack of awareness amongst other civil society networks, activists, and practitioners engaging with the COP on these intersections. And so our first goal really was to raise awareness and forge a narrative shift for demilitarization within civil society organizations and activists participating in the COPs. So really raising awareness about the interconnections between military spending and climate finance, and raising awareness about the impacts of militarism on the climate crisis, etc. And so what we did to really firmly place this topic within the civil society constituencies was that we set up an official working group within the Feminist Caucus. The Women and Gender constituency of WILPF is a member. And this firstly allowed us to get buy-in from the feminist coalition, but it also, the working group also provided a space to mobilize folks, to brainstorm together, to plot advocacy activities, and to influence and raise awareness among other civil society movements and organizations. So for those of you who might not know this, there are 9 different constituencies, civil society constituencies that influence the negotiations. They range from indigenous peoples to trade unions and the Feminist Caucus or young people. And so while we set up the working group within the Feminist Caucus, we made it cross-constitutional. So we invited folks from other coalitions to also join the working group to really make this an intersectional issue where the whole civil society climate justice movement really could join the call for demilitarization. And so we took some time to spread awareness and also to provide concrete messaging to others that were interested in the topic that they could then use in their advocacy. But then Russia's invasion of Ukraine happened, and then Israel's genocide of Palestine happened. And these 2 really devastating developments, I think, meant that the climate justice movement really woke up and came to realize and understand the profound links between climate justice and demilitarization. And so at this point, I would say that the issue of demilitarization is really firmly embedded within the Women and Gender constituency, but also within other constituencies, including CAN, which is the Climate Action Network. It's the largest global climate justice coalition, civil society coalition that is also inputting into the COP process. And they have, for example, now included demilitarization as one of their key pillars in their new 5-year strategy. So just to say that positively, there has been a huge growth in awareness and mobilization across issues and movements over the past few years on militarism and military spending and how that intersects with climate injustice. And so beyond raising awareness and mobilizing civil society movements, the other avenue that we have started exploring is how we can get our demands for reallocation of military spending into the official negotiations at COP and what are the arguments that we can use. And so in 2023, we published a 3-pager where we explored this in more depth. But basically, in terms of existing international climate instruments, we do have one entryway, and that is the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement in Article 2.1c obliges states to, and I quote, making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions and climate resilient development. And so what this means is it demands to align all financial flows through regulatory frameworks and policy measures with climate mitigation and adaptation. And it also means to actively divest and shift away from financial activities that exacerbate the climate crisis. And so we argue, obviously, that military spending profoundly undermines the mandate of this article, and therefore military spending should be progressively reduced and reallocated. Another entry point that we used was the Declaration for Climate Peace, for Climate Recovery, Relief and Peace. That declaration was adopted at COP28 in Dubai in 2023. And COP28 was a milestone because it was the first COP where peace featured as an official theme in the agenda. And as a result of that theme being featured, this declaration was adopted. The declaration completely omits a root cause analysis of both the climate crisis and conflict, of which militarization is obviously a huge factor. So we used the declaration to criticize this and again center and amplify our messages for centered around demilitarization. And then there's a few other entry points that we identified that we could use for to spotlight this issue in technical negotiations, but I won't go into those. That might be too technical for this discussion today. But if you're interested, you can read the 3-pager. But I do want to say that while the issue of military spending has not made it yet into the official negotiations, there are states already that are making the connections between climate finance and military spending in high-level statements at COPs. And that is really important for us when we are mapping peace champions. So when we are trying to, eventually bring a group of countries together that can champion this issue also within the climate talks. And I want to share 2 quotes by 2 different countries that have made the connections at last year's COP, COP29 in Baku in Azerbaijan. So Mexico said in the high-level debate, and I quote now, "We reiterate President Claudia Sheinbaum's call made during the G20 Leader Summit to dedicate 1% of military spending to a reforestation program that would restore 15 million hectares and capture millions of tons of carbon dioxide. The proposal is simple but clear. The aim is to give fewer resources for war to plant the seeds for peace." And Nepal said also last year at COP29, the vast resources spent on arms should be redirected to mitigation efforts. So knowing that there are countries that are aware of these links and are making the connections, even if it's only at a high level at this point, is a really good starting point. So now if we're looking ahead to COP30, which will take place in Belém in Brazil in November this year. So what's not so good is that peace doesn't feature as an official theme this year at all. It's not mentioned in any of the president's letters. So yeah, it doesn't seem to be a focus this year, which is a real shame. However, Lula, Brazil's president, has been one of the leaders that also has been consistently outspoken on a mismatch between rising military spending and the lacking of climate finance. And at COP28, he said at the high-level segment, and I quote again, "It is unacceptable that the promise of 100 billion a year made by the developed world will not come to fruition, while in 2021 alone, military spending reached 2.2 trillion. So even though peace or militarism isn't featuring in the official agenda of the COP this year, there are still some really crucial entry points. And so what we will continue to do at this COP, based on the activities and experiences that we've accumulated over the past years, is we'll continue to raise awareness, we'll provide concrete messaging and proposals on how military spending could feature in the negotiations through side events, actions, which are staged protests at the UN climate talks, and they always garner a lot of media attention. We will organize press conferences, and also importantly, reach out to diplomats from those countries that have made the connections in their high-level statements, so that we hopefully have a group of countries that will spearhead this issue and find ways to bring it into the climate finance discussions and negotiations. So I just want to end on a positive note that while we are seeing this hyper-militarization on the one hand, on the other hand, there are circulating a lot of ideas, a lot of proposals on reallocating military spending to climate finance. And there is real energy and momentum in different spaces. So we need to continue to mobilize and really harness this energy and awareness and bring movements together. And also develop more of a relationship with those countries that do continue to call out this misallocation. So yeah, I'll leave it here and I look forward to any questions and a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you. That was really interesting, and I think also really worked well with one another. And I'll start with the questions that have been asked in the chat and in the Q&A. One of the questions, maybe I'll kind of connect them together, but is a bit around the let's say that the gap that, while on the one hand, I think the analysis and the conversation, as you said, Katrin, just now, that the conversation on civil society connecting militarization and or demilitarization and the opportunities in that with the needs, the financial needs in climate justice is really part of the conversation. But then on the policy level, we see beginnings of conversations, but it's much harder to see traction there. So I think that's one question, was really around kind of the official forums in COP, and do you see some changes there? I mean, some of it was already brought out in the quotes from different governments, but in negotiations, I know that while on the social justice side of things, I would say, or the movement side of things, both after during the genocide in Gaza, as well as the invasion of Ukraine, this connection became stronger. But on the other hand, on the discourse, on the negotiation level, I think there were a lot of steps back on kind of demilitarization or on policy level. So if you have some thoughts on any one of you, really, on this question of kind of how this translates in the official forums.
I don't really have much to add to your analysis, Sahar, because yeah, I think that's exactly the issue that we're seeing, is that we're seeing this huge uprising, cross-movement, collaboration, awareness raising on these intersections because of the devastating geopolitical developments that we've seen over the past years. And that's just in such stark discrepancy to what's going on in the negotiation rooms at the COPs. And I think there's just, civil society has been frustrated with the COP space for many years, but I think the increased detachment of negotiations that are going on in these rooms versus what's happening on the ground is becoming increasingly frustrating. And there's, for example, at the Bonn Climate Change Conference this year, there's been an open letter by civil society that has called for, the reform of the COP and the UNFCCC, because it's just not working how it's intended to. But yeah, I think beyond the high level statements that I mentioned, and there are a few more by some countries that are making these connections, the resistance has gotten much stronger. And so I think, yeah, it's really important that we express our support to those countries that are still speaking up about this and are making the connections, and trying to work more closely together with them to really find ways of bringing this discussion into the technical negotiations, just because it's such a huge piece of the puzzle. Like, military spending is such a huge obstacle to anything that we want to do in the climate justice space, that it just needs to be addressed if we're serious about this. So yeah, but I don't have much more to add than that. Sorry.
Raouf, you had your hand up before, and then as well, and Gaya as
Yeah,
well.
okay, so we're having this webinar during a very hard time with all the genocide happening, with all the war, the crimes and all. And I'm following also my comrades in the flotilla going to Gaza, and I hope the best for them. And then we find that how wars mean to this rich country, to this big country. It is a chance for them to give more loans. It is a chance for them for the money to keep flowing. It's a chance for them to make more benefits. And this is how we understand all this relation between war, between reducing military spending, between saving the climate, and this is how also we understand that all the social rights need to work together against this system. I participated in 5 COPs before, and I was trying to follow the NCQG, and you find out that you're putting a lot of effort to make just a very small impact or a very small change. And just by giving 300 billions every year, but we shouldn't forget that they said South corporation counts. So they don't want to put responsibility on themselves. So even if you have this kind of money flowing or a corporation happening between the 2 global South countries, it still count. So they don't want to take responsibility. I'm seeing a very interesting questions. I'm not sure if we start answering the question that we have. I've seen one saying in COP and other official forms, how much are this idea of debt cancellation? We still have a lot of work we need to do. All the thing now they're speaking about, they're speaking only about debt swap. They're speaking more about, yeah, we're seeing at least some of the global South countries now start speaking about grants and all. And they start speaking about how we should put responsibility on the global North country. And this, I want to go to the other question, if it is possible to hold a monetary organism from developing country accountable and ask reallocation of debts. It is very possible. If we do the right thing, by doing a debt audit, it is very possible. Now we're starting a debt audit in Senegal. We're trying to see that the debt are illegitimate. The loans were given to a dictator country, which is illegal. They weren't spent, or at least part of them, they weren't spent on social field, which is illegal. A lack of transparency by the World Bank and the IMF, and they know that, which is illegal also. And by showing all of this, by doing the debt audit, it is possible. And the other part of the question, Beside that cancellation, has there been any conversation on debt reallocation for climate finance instead? I can't say so actually, but for now, mostly we're focusing on canceling the debt. For some countries like Tunisia, for example, we're only responsible of 0.007% of climate change, I'd say. So even if we manage to have the money, we're not polluting a lot like the big countries. What we need to spend is for adaptation and fix all the social problems and all. And then it is a great question of, are there successful
So
example?
maybe, Raouf,
Sorry,
before we run
I'm
that, I
sorry.
think Gaya had a few comments on the
Oh
previous
yeah,
as well,
yeah.
and then we can run to the
Thank you
other.
so much. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. And Raouf, that was great. I think I like the way that you address those questions, and I think, they're really excellent questions, so I can also continue from there. I mean, just speaking about debt as an issue within the climate space. So it is being discussed, and it has been increasingly discussed over the last few years. I think one of the problems there is that, the climate convention doesn't actually have any teeth or any ability to impact the debt space. So what we're really looking to is like to connect the conversations there with the Financing for Development Forum and other spaces where there is actual conversations going on about debt that can have an impact. So that is one of the problems, is that these things impact the climate space so much, but we have no control over them within the climate space. I think there was a question about redirecting subsidies. It's like, Katrin, you mentioned that the climate talks are so frustrating, and I don't want to keep going on about that because we could just end up complaining all day long. One of the sort of like ironic things is that it was only in COP28 2 years ago that we were allowed to say that we want to phase out fossil fuels, which is kind of insane, right? Like that it was actually included in the text. And within that, there was a discussion of subsidies as well. So subsidies are now within the formal text. But I think, this concept of this space being flawed is sort of points to a broader question of what is our strategy, right? Because we know these spaces are flawed. We know that it is important to get the narrative right there, because there is a power in that. It does drive finance. It does drive agendas. Like, it's not a completely useless space, and it's important to shape the narrative there. But I think especially with like if we're talking about military financing, where the rubber really hits the road is in the global north countries. So what we really need to be doing is like working with movements on the ground there to build strong narratives about how this is a waste of money overall for everybody. And I know that your movements are already doing that. So I think then making the link to climate, saying there are so many more productive ways we could be using this money, and making the case for it being a solidarity move to take this money away from killing people to helping people. Rather than, we know that there are like lots of far right movements now which would like to say, pull up the drawbridge and say, we don't want to give any money to anybody. But if we could reframe it in the terms of like solidarity and moving money away to help all of us, I think that would be really helpful. Another issue about debt and how it's being discussed around climate, as Raouf mentioned, it's like what we really want is debt cancellation, but what we're seeing is this kind of move towards these interim solutions, like, oh, let's have debt swaps which come with their own. So we have climate debt swaps where a country can swap out its debt for some kind of defined climate action, but with that comes questions of sovereignty and how much control they have then over, let's say, a protected area or a forest that is being the focus of this climate action. And there's also like the ethical issue of, is this debt even legitimate to begin with? So we do see a lot of being drawn into these kinds of conversations, but I think also there are some like other areas that need attention. Over the last few years, people have been talking a lot about the surcharges that come with debt and how absolutely punishing they are. These are just fees that they pay on top of all their principal and interest. So attacking that, dismantling surcharges, And also very specifically within the realm of climate. So Barbados has come up with some interesting proposals over the last few years, saying that there should at the very least be pauses in the payment of debt payments in the event of a natural disaster that is climate related or not, quite frankly. But there is so much incoherence within the debt system that the climate movement is trying to influence and trying to create some like fiscal space for countries to recover after climate events. Yeah. So anyway, I'll let Raouf or Katrin add.
Yeah, and I'll just add that last question that, I mean, it's to Raouf, but anyone who has maybe examples, was a question about if there's successful examples of countries refusing to pay debt. And I'll take that maybe even wider. If you can think either of debt cancellation, but of other things that a country has managed to successfully stand up to a lot of these systems.
There are some great examples. So, well, for country who refuse to pay it, we have a good question of Colombia. Oh, of Ecuador, I'm sorry, of Ecuador. Ecuador, they audited their debt and they declared 3 billion as an illegitimate debt and they refused to pay them. And then, yeah, the result was that Ecuador managed to restructure the rest of its debt at lower rates and use the saving for social and development program. And also we have the example of Argentina. They refused to pay the debt in 2001. We have another example of, wait, I'm trying to find because I remember some was written here, but yeah, okay, yeah, we have Bolivia, we have Iceland in 2008 that refused to pay the UK debt because of the economic crisis. But a good example of debt cancellation, we have the debt cancellation of Germany in 1953. So after the World War II, they canceled the debt of Germany. 50% of its debt was canceled, and they restructured the other 50% and they gave them grants. And now we're seeing how Germany is doing. So what I can say also that we have a good examples of Germany. We have an example of Singapore also. A part of its debt also were canceled before. We have Iceland and all. So the question is, if we have good example like this, why we still, or the imperialist country and the World Bank and IMF still talking about the debt swap? We have good examples already. So do the same like you did with Germany and cancel the debt. But I mean, maybe because Germany in Europe and it is better for the European Union to have Germany strong, etc., etc. I don't know. But I mean, yeah, there are good examples, successful examples. And this is why also we're saying that debt cancellation is a solution, I mean.
Gaya, please, you want
Yeah,
to...
just on debt cancellation, I agree with Raouf. I think there's a lot of hypocritical politics around who gets to cancel their debt and who doesn't. We've seen countries really, we have seen countries default. I was just seeing that Mariana's on the call, and Argentina has famously done that. But there are costs to pay. I mean, like Argentina had their naval boat confiscated by creditors. And I think because we live in a much more integrated global market now, it's very difficult for countries to default because countries need access to credit. And if you default on your debt, you're not going to be able to get credit on the markets, and that constrains you economically. So it's a very difficult, costly thing to do. And the creditors make it difficult. It's incentivized to make it hard for countries to default. There are conversations about having borrowers clubs where borrowers can band together and maybe even like default as a group, because then there's less likely to have adverse consequences if you do it in a collective. So that there are lots of conversations going on about various tactics, but just to say that it is in the current financial climate, it is very, very difficult for a country to do that. So there's a reason why it doesn't happen more often than it should, probably.
Yeah, and I think on that kind of the difference between defaulting and the country deciding it with all the consequences and debt cancellation, which does not have those consequences, and I think was very clear with the examples of kind of the inherent racism that is within of a country like Germany, and I dare say I don't think it was just because of the interest of the future European Union, but also just again that those kind of very racist. Oh, it's a white country in the middle of Europe. Obviously, they need like us kind of thing. We're not going to yeah, we can forgive that kind of debt, and it's obviously the same kind of mechanisms that we see within states on internally when debt is forgiven for banks and whoever else, while obviously individuals don't, and we kind of know these mechanisms. But one of the things that was important for me, I think, in this call was to try to really talk about kind of those opportunities. I think seeing the places where it did happen is very important, and seeing the places where social movements are really shifting is really important. But one thing that I kind of wanted to add to this conversation is that a lot of these processes that we're talking about, these ideas we're talking about, they're taking a lot of time. And there's a conversation about how long does it take to get something even on the table in COP. And then maybe 5 years later, it'll be actually part of something concrete. And maybe 5 years later, it'll be implemented. And I think when we talk about the climate crisis, we obviously know that there's an urgency of time. But also when we talk about the effects of militarism, I mean, when we talk about genocide, obviously, all of these things, there's an urgency to it. And I am wondering, just because I want people to leave this conversation also with kind of what do we do with that feeling of urgency? If there's some things that you want to pitch of kind of someone understanding this analysis, knowing what different movements are doing, what can be done now that I know is not going to have an effect tomorrow. We're not that naive. We know we are doing structural change here, but that we can realistically see where it's heading to and can affect this very urgent reality that we live in.
I can just sort of repeat a little bit what I said earlier, which is this, like, we need to build a strong narrative to reclaim the public's rights over public finance and our democratic right to determine where it goes. And I think that this I think it's really important to both build a narrative and to link it specifically to issues like militarization and to make the case that this is not serving people. I do think it will require the building of strong political movements on the ground in the global north specifically to make that case. And I see that already happening, and I think the world is changing very fast, and sometimes it feels like it's changing in a very negative direction. But I think with all of this upheaval, there will be opportunities for us to really push through, new narratives and to, I think, I mean, one of the weird things about this authoritarian sort of like turn that the world is taking is that it is very anti-interventionist in some ways. So how can we obviously not like green light their terrible narratives, but maybe use that sentiment and build upon it? Because it does seem to be a populist sentiment to be anti-interventionist, to not get involved in wars, to not be constantly spending money on endless wars. I'm based in the US, and it's very, very unpopular. So how can we, on the more progressive front, take those messages and be as effective as the right wing has to make a more positive case to people, because the energy is already there?
I want to mention an initiative that amidst everything else is giving me a lot of hope, and where people can get involved at different levels, and that is the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, because it seeks to really address one of the root cause of the climate crisis, as well as the very foundation of militarism, which is fossil fuels. And as Gaya mentioned, it's wild that the term fossil fuels only made it into the outcome documents at COP28. So this fossil fuel treaty is right now only an idea, but it seeks to phase out, stop expansion of fossil fuels and phase out fossil fuels, and support international corporations for a just transition. And the initiative right now is at a really critical time because 17 states have so far endorsed this initiative, and Colombia just announced that it will host the first intergovernmental conference to basically start the process towards a treaty next year. And of course, it can be argued that, it's again another multilateral process, and it might take years. But I think regardless of the outcome of this treaty, and of course, ideally we want a treaty as quickly as possible, I think just this movement towards the treaty, and again, it's like the movement that is sustaining this initiative so far is global, is intersectional. It brings together indigenous peoples, feminists, peace activists, and so similar, and we've seen this with other international processes and treaties, such as the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that even though we don't have a treaty yet, only by kind of working towards the treaty, narratives are shifting, and fossil fuels are becoming more and more stigmatized, and there might already, it might just help the kind of tide against fossil fuels. So yeah, and it just feels like a really hopeful initiative at this point in time. And I think it has a potential to not only be a climate treaty, but also really a peace treaty for the reasons I mentioned, because fossil fuels are the very foundation of militarism. And I mean, we need to see how it plays out. But right now, the narrative is also really strong on the need to, in the just transition, not replicate the same systems of extraction and exploitation that we've seen with fossil fuels to happen with renewable energy, right? So anyway, that initiative has given me a lot of hope, and there's ways that people can get involved at the national, local, international levels. They can get, try and get their countries on board to support this treaty. There's lots of cool things going on, and so I really, yeah, find that is a good way to get positively engaged on this.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add actually, because what we're doing now, I think it is good, especially by showing the intersection that we have together, that we're fighting the same enemy. But what I can say also that with what is happening now, with all the crimes happening, we shouldn't be afraid of being radical. You can be as much, I mean, you can be as radical as you want. It is nothing when you see what is happening from the system. So we shouldn't be ashamed by saying some radical stuff, or by being radical, or saying that we're fighting against the system. Our enemy is clear. The system is a criminal system. They're just making war to make more profit. They're just destroying nature and climate to make more profit. And that's what we're doing now. We're fighting all together. So yeah, we should be clear. We should be direct with our speech. We should just say what is it, the reality. Like, we're fighting against capitalism. Okay, fine. That's it. We're all together fighting against the same enemy. So that's it. I think it's very important to be in every space, not to leave any empty spaces, to be visible, to fight together with the right ideology, with the right speech. And yeah, by doing all of this, coalition is very important. By showing all the intersections that we have together, like if I am fighting for that cancellation and the others are fighting for any other social justice, we have space together. We need to fight all together. And yeah, I think what is important is to keep fighting together, to keep having more people together in the same fight.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think that all of these things kind of coming together, looking at the power that we do have in intersections and the different movements that are involved in here, the different places where, and we spoke a lot, I think, about this around kind of movements within also the global south that are happening, including even to state and policy levels that are shifting in this way, and that to kind of see that the power actually lies in a much wider space than people would like us to think about how power and where, how power lies. So I think that's really, really important. And you spoke a lot, all three of you, I think, about the kind of the power of solidarity within that context and creating that narrative around this solidarity. So I think that's all extremely helpful. I would just really say in half a sentence that I think that for us in the 10% campaign, that's really a lot of what we're trying to do as well, kind of bring people from the different movements, from different places together around this intersection, and trying to amplify some of the work that is happening. So it's really important for us to hear this and what is happening and how it all connects to each other. And we're really happy to continue to connect anyone who wants to find any of the initiatives that were spoken about here today. So obviously WILPF and Move the Money campaign, Debt for Climate, the 10% campaign, all very Googleable, or any other search engine that you prefer, as well as look up the links that are here. And really thank you everyone for being part of this conversation, and hopefully it will be continued in the future.